Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you and welcome to Islam and Life with me, Tariq Ramadan, broadcasting from London. In today's show, we ask the question, are Muslims in Marseille being treated as equal citizens?
According to independent research, 30 to 40% of the population in Marseille is Muslim, mostly of Tunisian or Algerian descent. Demographers say Marseille will be the first Muslim-majority city in Western Europe. Marseille has been labelled as being one of the most dangerous cities in the world, rife with poverty and violence. And many commentators, such as Daniel Greenfield, have linked the increasing number of Muslims residing there as a reason for this, going as far to say, Marseille doesn't have a violence problem, it has a Muslim immigration problem. But a report conducted by the Open Society Foundation in 2011, titled Muslims in Marseille, stated that Muslims are not included in public policies and debates around education, employment and housing in Marseille, making it difficult to address vast inequities. This week on Islam and Life, we ask, are Muslims in Marseille being treated as equal citizens?
This is a fair question. When it comes to the situation of Muslims in France, we are talking about citizenship, we are talking about equal citizenship, and wherever we talk about the reality on the ground, there are problems. First, the social reality and the social status when it comes to education, when it comes to employment, when it comes to marginalization. And what we see in Marseille is a situation where there is violence, but very often people are connecting this violence to the reality on the ground. So to Islamize the social problems in France is something which is very a reality that we see throughout the political spectrum. It's not only coming from the far-right party or the populist parties. We can see this with the socialists, we can see this with the traditional right parties on the right hand side of the political spectrum. What we see here is the reality of a discourse and understanding that Islam and Muslims are targeted sometimes because they are Muslims and not really treated as equal citizens. There is a problem here when it comes to the social reality, when it comes to the religious pluralism within the society. And Marseille is a very good example. It's in fact a laboratory where we can see the different trends and we can see what is happening on the political side, on the social side, on the religious side of the French reality. So what is happening? What are the trends? Why is it so difficult for people to live together? And what is expressed as a historical experience in Marseille? These are critical questions, and to answer all these questions, I'm joined by my guest, Nabila Ramdani, a French journalist. Thank you so much for being with us today. Let me start with this question, because very often we speak about Marseille. We know that Roubaix is also a city where the Muslims are almost in majority now. But the reality in Marseille, it's a big city, and we see day in, day out, we hear about violence there, and we have some politicians saying, oh, the problem is much more about segregation based on ethnicity and based on religion. So is there a specific problem with Marseille?
Well, I think the first thing I'd like to say is that the premise upon which the discussion is based is a rather disturbing one. I mean, saying that a lot of crime in Marseille involves Muslims is almost like saying like a lot of crimes in Rome involves Catholics. Marseille has had a vast Muslim community for hundreds of years, and for very obvious reasons. It's a big port city which has linked throughout history Europe to Africa and to North Africa, and it has welcomed Arabs and Muslims throughout history, precisely because of the legacy of French colonization. But I think also, just as it is wrong to link Marseille's crime with Islam, so it is wrong to link or to make out that there is anything new or anything exceptional in this. Marseille is a big port city, and has always been crime-ridden, and there's nothing new in that. And this is also the case with big cities right at the heart of the world's drug trade. And I'm sure a lot of us would have seen the movie The French Connection, and unless I can't remember properly, there were very few Muslims involved. And so it is, you know.
So mainly because this is a very important question, you're saying there is a very long tradition of violence in Marseille connected to drugs and not with Muslims, and connected to networks that were there much before Muslims came. What we hear coming from the far-right party and populist parties say, that might be true, but the level and the density of this violence now is completely different from what we had before. There is something which was called by a sociologist the Americanization of the suburbs in Marseille, with more violence. And he's connecting this to what is also something in the United States of America, which is the inner cities and the black, saying, because now we have more Muslims, so this is why. So he's connecting this increasing violence with the increasing number of Muslims.
But that is such a disingenuous link to make. This is what is happening is the usual trick of blurring identities and linking or equating violence with Islam. And this has been happening in France for many years. Look at the way the previous president, Nicolas Sarkozy, managed to link Muslim veils with terrorism. Look at the way Marine Le Pen, the leader of the National Front, managed to link Muslims praying in the streets with public disorder. And this has been going on for a long time, this disingenuous equation between violence and indeed Islam. It's just pure propaganda, and it is disingenuous, and it's not based on...
Yes, so how would you respond to the people by saying, look, now we are talking about citizenship, and the big question that we have today is, are the Muslim French citizens treated equally? Because what we had during the last local election at the municipality level is we can see that things are moving not in the right way in France, and that the populist parties, and even in Marseille, we have in one region someone coming from the Front National who won. So meaning that there are here trends that are gaining ground at the local level. So what is happening? How would you analyze the situation of Muslim citizens or Muslim French citizens in Marseille today?
I think the crux of the matter is an issue of inequality or indeed equal opportunities, which are lacking. And this has been the history of post-colonial France, and meaning that the legacy of the empire is one of indigenous communities being exploited by France and then exported to France, to mainland France, but which were literally placed at the margins of society, and that is where they remain until today. Many Muslims do you find in prosperous middle-class areas of big cities like Paris or indeed Marseille? Very few, because they still remain at the margin to this day, and they experience everything, like discrimination, unemployment, discrimination in every walk of life, in unemployment, in housing, in education, lack of opportunities. And this is something that the French government hasn't been able to tackle. It has very toothless anti-discrimination laws which are not in force. And there's a very important statistics. For example, the United Nations have a report every year. They look at countries around the world and they look at how countries treat their ethnic minorities, which is an indication of an advanced society. The better you treat the more vulnerable members of your society, the better advanced you are. France invariably ends up in the top 12, alongside countries which have a very poor track record for treating their minorities. And that's something they should be ashamed of, that the political class in France should be ashamed of.
But in France, the discourse have been involved in these discussions in France when it comes to, we don't treat with minority, we treat with citizenship. So French Muslims or French Muslims are citizens. So when you are talking about minorities, are you talking about the residents? Are you talking about the migrants? Because still today in France, and even in Marseille, there is a connection between the French Muslim citizens and immigration. It's as if we are still connecting this. So when you talk about minority, you talk about the religious minority, ethnic minority, people who are coming from northern African countries who are now French citizens and they are still facing discrimination?
Well, I'm talking about immigrants, for example, from North African background, and since we're talking about Muslims of Muslim backgrounds, but also those within French society who are French, but who are perceived as foreigners, and therefore are not granted the same rights that they should be granted as French citizens. And that's when the government and successive governments, in fact, have failed in giving people the rights that they have. I think a very important matter is also when we look at the key really is integration, and the French Republic has failed to integrate its minorities in many ways. If we look at the nuts and bolts of democracy, if we look at an issue like voting, for example, in the field of voting, successive French governments, and especially socialist governments, have been promising to give immigrants the vote to minorities at local elections, and that literally since the 1980s. And this hasn't happened as of yet. And this is a very important point because this would allow communities, any community, to engage with their political parties, to engage with the city they live in, and to actually take a part in the decision-making of the city where they live in, and make it a better place, and deal with concerns, local concerns. And that's a definite way of making sure that people are part and parcel of the area they live in, and to create a sense of belonging. And instead, we have very offensive policies, discriminatory policies, which create a sense of exclusion and not of belonging.
Yes, but that's fine, and I think that this is a reality that you can see on the ground in France. Now, how is it that, once again, if we look at the French Muslims, they are not so much involved in election, they are not voting so much. What we have seen during the last local election is some of them have been elected even, so they are now more and more politically visible. But yet, after 2 or 3 generations, even 5 generations in some areas in France, we don't have this political involvement. If we want to change, if something has to be changed as to the citizenship and the status, they have to be much more involved in politics, isn't it?
But I think what's happening to the Muslim community is also a reflection of the French people in general. And especially at the latest elections, we have seen that there was very low interest and very low turnout. So it's a disaffection between French people and the governing class in general that is happening. French people, whatever their background, have a lack of trust in those who govern them because of the failure to deliver, the failure to make their lives better, corruption, endemic corruption as well. So all these are issues that make people reluctant to go and vote. And if you look at other communities, and the Muslim community in particular, you need to have an incentive. You need to make sure that when people do go and vote, their vote is going to mean something. But the reality is it's very difficult for any French Muslim to make his or her way up through society. France is not egalitarian Britain. You don't see social mobility in France. And in fact, there was an interesting study carried out by Open Society which looked at Muslims across 11 cities in Europe. And there was a very interesting percentage statistic in the UK which showed that more than 80% of British Muslims saw themselves as belonging to their local community first, and then the big city above them, and then see themselves as English and then British, and further down the line as Muslims, which shows that they have, they feel a sense of belonging to their country. In France, this figure went down to 40%. So there is a great disconnect between being a French Muslim and feeling that you're part of society and any other experience in Europe and especially in the UK.
Yes, that's important. I have two last questions. The first one is about, we are talking about citizenship and equal citizenship, and what you are saying is that there is a problem and there is discrimination on the ground when it comes to employment and housing and even the geographical presence in the country. Is there still a Muslim problem, an Islamic problem, the problem of Islam in France? Because when I was talking, I can talk like this, and I was supporting the view that you have, saying the most important problems are socio-economic problems, and still you have people saying, yes, that's true, but you cannot deny that there is a problem with Islam and Muslims in France. Would you agree with that?
No, I would absolutely disagree with that. There are very clear and unambiguous sociological studies which show the level of integration between different waves of immigration to France. Looking at the first post-World War I wave of immigration, which was largely European, Catholic or Christian and white, and the second wave of immigration after the Second World War, which was largely North African, African or from Sub-Sahara Africa, Muslim and more visible. All studies unequivocally show that the wave of immigrants coming from a Muslim background, a North African or African background, integrated far better to French society than the European, Christian and white communities. So it's unambiguous that it is not an Islamic problem. Islam has always been part and parcel of the European legacy, but cynical politicians have always made sure to present it as something that's alien, that doesn't belong to Europe, or that is not part of French culture. It has always been part of French culture in an indirect way through colonization. And it's because of that strong link of colonization that Muslims in France, who are largely from North Africa, have been able to integrate far better. So to create the impression that there's a Muslim problem is cynical and disingenuous in the extreme.
So the second question is about what should be done. If you look at the situation, and once again we are talking about Marseille and we see how things are, because the level of discrimination, disenfranchisement, and all these realities that we have on the ground, this is where we can find this with violence and add to this unemployment. What should be the first step? Is it, for example, for the French citizens to say, look, Islam is not a problem, we want to avoid talking about this as the starting point of our common citizenship?
I think there are two things that need to be done, and they are intrinsically linked. I think there needs to be a regain of trust from the French to their, in relation to their governments. And that would encourage people to go and vote more and to engage with the political class more. And when it comes to the Muslim community, again, institutions who discriminate against Muslims need to be punished. And in order to include and to be more representative of modern France is diverse. And yet, if you look at France from the outside, if you look at their institutions, their political institutions, if you look at their media, if you look at the big companies, you won't see an indication that it is an inclusive country of, all sorts of minorities. And that is something that people need to see in order to feel perhaps encouraged to contribute and to participate more. If you see people like you in politics or on TV, or indeed engaging in all sorts of ways with society, then you would be encouraged to contribute as well.
Yes, but if I listen to you, if it's as if it's coming from the institutions, this is the first thing, that we need to gain trust, and this is between the government and the people. The second is the businesses, enterprises or companies that are discriminating should be punished, and this has to be a signal that something is done in the name of social justice. What should be done from the side of the citizens themselves? Because we were talking about being involved in politics, and you said they are like all the others. But when you are a discriminated religious or cultural minorities. You have to be more involved in politics. So do we have to expect something from the French citizens themselves, being Muslims and discriminated, to change this situation?
I think one important thing to say is that the private sector, private companies discriminate far less than state institutions. And in that respect, you see a lot of French Muslims who start their own companies or work in the private sector and have no problem whatsoever. So in a way, they are bypassing state discrimination to their advantage. But it's no substitute from social justice and from a fair government that looks and protects looks after and protects all its citizens. So it very much is more of a problem coming from the state than it is from the private sector.
But what would you say to citizens living in Marseille now, facing discrimination, saying, I cannot get it, and I am perceived as a Muslim, so as a foreigner. So what would be your advice?
Well, again, it's difficult to engage with politics when you don't see that it is making any change at the local level. But indeed, organizing yourselves in pressure groups in order to perhaps have more power at the local level. That is, that makes all the difference in your day-to-day life. But also make sure that the forces of law and order do not discriminate in their job as well, and go after the real criminals instead of stigmatizing, decent Muslims going about their day-to-day lives, but are tarnished and are being branded as those behind the violence.
Thank you so much. Listening to you, I think that we come back to something which is the very important point when it comes to the situation in Marseille, which is in fact reflecting the situation in France. It's not a religious problem. Islam is not the reason why people are facing social discrimination. It has to do, and you said it twice, about colonization and the colonial past of France. That also is a problem. And then the situation on the ground where the people are facing discrimination, marginalization, on all the fields, from education to employment. And what you are saying, which is also important, is in fact the reason for that is much more coming from the state and the institutions than the people. Of course, yes, people should gain more trust in the institution, but signals should come from the state, signals should come from the institutions, and this is where France also can and should solve the problem. And you were comparing the situation in France and in Britain, showing how much things are different, and this means that it has nothing to do with religion, it has to do with policy. Well, that's all we have time for. Please let us know your thoughts and views on any of the shows you have seen, and here is the way to contact us.
We at Islam and Life would like to hear your views about the subjects that we discuss. We would also love to hear your suggestions for our program, so get in touch with us. You can also share your thoughts with other Islam and Life fans, engage in debate, and find out how to watch our previous shows. Follow us on Twitter at Islam and Life TV, or join us on Facebook by liking our page Islam and Life on Press TV.
Finally, I would like to thank my guest, Namira Ramdani. Thank you so much for being with us and your insight. And I hope to see you next week, inshallah.